started reading about AngularJS. It was starting to become something that was really trendy. Everybody was using it. A lot of people were loving it. So I decided, hey, why not? Let's learn it as well. So I decided to learn Angular. At that point, I started Googling around and searching for different tutorials, different ways of learning it. And most tutorials were actually really short, like 20 minutes or something like that, and you could have your app running. So this was my first app. I have an input, type text. In there, I have an ng model, which has the bidirectional association with the controller. Then I just display what the person enters. So in this case, if in here I write Gonto, et voila, Gonto shows up. So after this, I was really, really, really happy because I got my first Angular app working. I meant I knew AngularJS. I felt exactly like Neo in Matrix, where he just connected something and he knew Kung Fu. But in my case, I connected something and I just learned AngularJS. At that point, I was so happy that I wanted to apply it to my real life, not only just testing stuff and looking it out for myself. So at that point, I told my boss, I know AngularJS. So then he came and he said, OK, you know AngularJS? This is our model. This is our backend API. This is our backend models. And this is what you need to get. This is what you need to use from the front end. You have a user. The user has a lot of cars. The user also has a lot of profiles. The cars has mechanic. And it was kind of a complex model, a regular model that you could have in your backend. So I started looking around because I thought I knew AngularJS, but I just knew the little example. So after Googling a little bit, I found $resource. $resource was designed to do what I needed. It was a REST client for AngularJS so that I could get all the models that I needed from my server using the REST API from my server. So I said, let's use it. Why not? So the first thing I thought was, let's fetch a user. It is the first entity we have. So in order to do that, what I did is, first, I created the $resource object. In there, the first thing I specified was the URL, which is, in this case, was the API version 1. I then set the user resource and the user ID. After getting that user resource, that user object, I just called the get method. In this case, sending as a parameter the ID that I needed, and also, as a second parameter, the callback. Inside the callback, just to test it out, I changed the name and called $save, which would do the correct put to the server. At this point, I was really happy. I got it working, 4 lines. But then I said, OK, now I have the user. Now let's get all the cars for that user. So I started again Googling around, and I found that the only way to do that was to create a new $resource object. In this case, this new $resource object, again, has the API version 1 specified. And as it is a nested RESTful resource of the user, I needed to specify the user resource, the user ID, the cars resource, and the cars ID. I needed to specify the full URL again. So after that, once I had that object, I just called the query. I sent the parameter as well for the callback. And in there, I got the first car, again, changed the name, and I saved it. So I started thinking a little bit about, was it good? Did I like it? Did I like how I got the car? And I started feeling something like this. I wasn't sure that this is what I liked, and mainly because of these reasons. Because first, $resource thinks that models aren't related. In my case, I had to create a different $resource object for each of my models, one for the user and one for the car. Also, it doesn't handle nestful RESTful resources. In our case, in most cases actually, everybody started using nested RESTful resources for specifying resources that had relationships. $resource knows nothing about that. Also, we can't add configurations per resource aggregation. What does it mean? Let's assume that I want some particular request params or some particular headers for all the queries, for all the gets that I do for mechanic resources and car resources, but not for users. in that case, I need to specify exactly that configuration for the mechanic and for the car again. I can't add a configuration particularly to those. So I didn't like it that much. So to recapitulate, this is what I needed. I needed the user, which has a list of cars, which has mechanics, and what I ended up having with $resource was this. A lot of models, no relationship, they don't know about each other. So again, I wasn't happy. And this is exactly the point where I started to think that $resource wasn't going to be enough. So I started again Googling around. I found Breeze, but it was too big for me. So at that point, I started building what then became Restangular. At that point, it was really coupled with my code, but I had a clear idea, at least at that point, of what I wanted. So let's see, for example, how I would handle these users and cars getting. The first thing I would want is to set the base URL. I want to set that I want to use the version 1 of my API for all requests, because let's assume that I will continue coding this up, and I will have a version 2 really soon. At that point, if I were using $resource, I would need to go through all of the resources and change that URL. With this, I can change it at just one point. Then, what I had to do is to get the user. In this case, what we're seeing is the restangular.one call. The one and all calls are just calls that point to a resource. It's like a proxy or something that points and specifies how the resource is going to be. In the one case, you just define the resource name, user in this case, and also the resource ID, specifying this single one, which is 123. After that, I just called get. In this case, what you will see is that after get, I call then. That's because in Restangular, everything is based on promises. I think that promises should be first-class citizen. $resource does have promises now. They've added it, but it's not the default behavior. The default behavior is just the callback, but I think that promises are actually cooler because they are easier to compose, they are easier to work with, and also it's an A+ standard that everybody's using. So your promises, once you know them, you will be able to use them everywhere. After that, in the success callback of the promise, again, I just changed the username and then just called put. With that, it will do the put to the correct URL and save that user. But now comes the interesting part. Now comes the part when I actually want to get the cars. So for that, the cars is actually a relationship from the user. A user has a lot of cars. So it makes sense that in order to get the cars, I should ask the user to get them. So that's what you see here. I'm asking the $scope.user just to get list of the cars. That will build up to the correct URL, which will be /user/ID/cars. After that, I'm getting the list, and in the success callback, I'm getting the first element in this case, and again, changing the name. When I call put here, it will also go to the correct URL. It will assume, in this case, that the ID of the car is the ID field, and it will do a put to the car's resource inside the user's resource for the ID of the car that is specified at that subindex, in this case, 0. Also, as another thing, the cars that you actually receive as a parameter here is an array, but it's actually a special array because it has some additional methods that Restangular has added. Very similar to objects where I've added put, for example, for editing it. In this case, I've added the post method. This post method will receive, for example, an object which will be sent to the server. And in this case, this cars array.post will actually create a new car for that user. So in this case, just saying cars.post will do the post to the /users/123, which was specified before, /cars. So that means that we can actually navigate all of our hierarchies using all and one, because all specifies a link to a collection resource, and one specifies a link to a single resource. So in this case, for example, in the first line, what I'm just doing is I'm pointing first to the users collection, and inside the users collection, I'm pointing to the cars resource and then calling a get. That means that not only elements that were received from the server, like user in this previous case, will have this one, all, or get list method, but also I can create my own proxy objects and nest them in case that I don't need to get the first object, the first resource, in case that I want to start with the second or the first nested resource. So at this point, I was actually pretty happy. Now I had my models. The models have a relationship to each other. I was able to get the models to know each other and get them. And I had all of the data then in my front end. But then I started thinking, OK, that's cool. But my models don't have a behavior now. Most of the times when we actually code in the backend, our models have behavior. And they should have in the front end as well. So again, I started Googling around. I started looking in Google about AngularJS and models. And this is basically what I found. I found that, for example, in this case, I have two buttons where the ng-click, what it does is just call a method in the controller, which in this case will be charge fuel or go to China. And that charge fuel will receive the model as a parameter. That means that the behavior of the model, which in this case is charge fuel, which should be in the model because the model should know what to do, is in the controller. So what I actually wanted was something like this, where I can call change fuel to the car. So I can say car.chargefuel 20 or something like that. So this is what I wanted, and this is what I ended up adding and building to Restangular. So we have two ways of actually doing it. Let's start with the easier one. Restangular has a hook called extend models. That extend model will actually receive as a first parameter the resource name, and as a second parameter, it will be a callback, which will be called for every object, for every resource that you get from the server. And then to that object, you can just add methods. So for example, in this case, I've added car.chargefuel, and I'm just adding new fuel to that car. The same as this, what you can do is actually called extend collection instead of model. And in that case, what you will be adding methods to is to the array, to the collection resource, instead of every single resource. But what is the problem with this? The problem is that in this case, I'm not using prototype, I'm not using classes, I'm not using anything. I'm just adding functions to the object. I've realized this a little bit later after building Restangular. So for now, what I've done is the following. First, in the extend model, I'm just injecting a factory called car. And for that car, I'm calling the method extend, passing as a parameter the object. That factory car, as you can see, is just a regular prototype. It has the constructor car, and then I define the method charge fuel with the correct parameters. But you will actually see, that in the last line, it has a special method called car.extend, which uses an extender service. I didn't add the code here because it was quite long, but the basic idea is that this will instantiate a new, it will create a new instance of that prototype, and then it will add all of the fields from your model object from the server to that new instance. If you actually want to see the code, I've added it into the slides in the appendix after the talk, so I can either show it afterwards or you can ask me about it. But the basic idea is that with this, you can still use prototypes. So now, going back to this slide, as a spoiler alert, AngularJS 2.0 is coming very soon. So Restangular 2.0 is coming very soon. Angular 2.0 will start using ECMAScript 6 plus, as they call it. It will use a lot of things from ECMAScript 6, particularly, for example, classes. Jeff Cross is actually building the data part of AngularJS 2.0, and the most important thing about it is that it will have a base class called model. They will use that base class called model to interact with a lot of services regarding data, like saving information offline in local storage, saving it into the database, saving it into cookies. So I really thought that Restangular should use model as well as the base class, because that way, that means that Restangular will be compatible with all other services that AngularJS has. And also, that meant that I had an opportunity to rebuild this extend model and add some cooler functionality instead of passing the objects as a function parameter in every case. So, what is the new idea? First, sorry for the lack of syntax highlighting, but syntax highlighters should get ECMAScript 6 soon. And in here, what I'm doing is I'm creating the factory car, and in this case, I'm just creating a new class, a new ECMAScript 6 class car, which will extend model. That model class is the AngularJS 2.0 class. Inside there, I first have a constructor, I'm setting the speed, and I'm also creating this charge fuel method, which will just add fuel. And then the cool thing is that what I will do is then in the last line, what you can see is that restangular.extendModel will just receive the resource name and the class. That class must inherit from model, but you can add whatever class you want. That means that for every resource, you can just set a class, and everything you get from that server will have the needed data and also the needed behavior that you need, because you have created the class here in the front end. So again, now I was even happier, because now I had data, I had the models, I had the relationships, and I also had behavior in the front end. But I still had URLs in the front end, even though they are not as obvious as with $resource. When I'm doing $scope.user.getListCars, as I was showing in the first example, that is still implying a lot of URLs. So I started thinking about hypermedia, HATOs, and basically what I've learned is that the developer should just know, in a lot of cases, one URL, the main point of entry to your models. In my case, it is the user. So I will just know the URL to the user. And then the object that is returned from the server, which has this user, will have two fields, for example. One field will reference to the list of cars, like cars.href, and then another field will reference to the places. That reference will be a URL. So that means that every element, every object, will know its relationships, and it will also know the URLs of those relationships. So I thought it made sense to actually add this as well in Restangular. So the best way to do this is, first, you need to configure something, which is the self-link. That will be the field where each object has a link to itself. Because, for example, if you get a list of users, every user will have a link that will represent itself. So in the first example, what I'm doing is exactly that. I'm first getting the list of all users with all users.getList. And then for the first user, I'm calling remove. That remove should do the delete on the server. By default, it would do the remove on /users/ the ID of that user. But I didn't want that to happen. If a user knows its URL, we should use that URL. So in this case, the self.href points to example.com/users/gonto. So that will be the URL that is used when doing the delete. Then, as another example, what I'm going to try to do now is to get the list of cars from the user. As I've shown you before, what we did before is just saying user.getListCars. But in this case, what I'm specifying is that the user will have a nested resource, which is called cars, but the URL for that resource will be the user.cars.href. That means that Restangular has a method called allURL and oneURL, where besides saying the resource name and maybe the resource ID, we can also specify there the resource URL. This means that now we don't know any URL at all, but the main point of entry, which was users. Once I did that, I just changed the name and then called put in the car. That put in the car will point to the URL that car has as a self element. So with this, we had the basics about getting models, the behavior, and now also self-linking elements or having just one URL in the front end. So I started adding a few other configurations that might make our life easier. One of those are interceptors in the flow. That means that every time we communicate to the server, we're going to have a request, a response, and maybe an error. So we can hook into that to add some behavior that we need. For example, all of our apps have loading. That loading, most of the times, depends on requests to the server. So what I'm doing here is every time there's a new request, I start the loading. And every time that there's an error or that I get a response, I stop the loading. That means that at only one place, I manage to have the loading done for all the app. I'm going to have to add loadings at some specific points, but this covers most of it. Some other configurations are, as I said, by default, when you're not using the URL linking, the ID field by default is assumed to be the ID field of that object. But for example, if you're using MongoDB or if you're using MongoLab for it, what you will see is that the ID is _ID $oil. So you can configure that in Restangular. You can set whatever path you want. Some other configurations that you can add is, for example, you can set default $HTTP parameters like cache. You can set default request params. You can set default headers. Also, you can set request suffix. For example, if all of your resources, if all of your requests must end in .json, you can add it. And lastly, if your server, for example, doesn't support put or delete, you can use the method override, which will send the post always, and then it will add the X method override header so that the server knows which method we actually meant. Another thing that I talked about before is scoped configurations. There are some times where I want a particular configuration for 3 or 4 resources, and then another configuration for the rest of the resources. In this case, for example, what you can use is the withConfig method. That withConfig method will give you a function callback where inside you can set any configuration that you want for Restangular that I've shown before and others that are in the README. In this case, what I'm doing is setting the default header xauth shamesbond. And this withConfig will actually return a new instance of Restangular. Most of the times, this is actually used as a factory so that you could have a Restangular service and then a bond Restangular service, in this case, as a different factory. Then, as an example, in the last line, what you will see is that I'm doing bond Restangular.one place and then calling the get. That get will have the header of Shame's bond. So he will be there in all requests. Some other things that it has e-tags by default. That means that if you use e-tags in your server, if modified since, if not modified, it will be handled by Restangular by itself, and it will handle also the not modified that you have. Also, as I said, it's based on promises. It will always use promises, except for the fact that what you can do also is calling the $object method. You can get an object reference similar to $resource, but most of the times you're going to be using promises and connecting those promises and composing them. Also, it supports all HTTP methods. If you have to use headers or trace, you can call it on every object. Not only we have put, post, delete, but also other HTTP methods. And you can also run custom operations. What it means is that sometimes your put, post aren't normal REST, which means that sometimes you have to put to a specific URL, which is kind of weird. You can use that with Restangular using the custom put, custom post methods, and then with that, you can point to whatever you want and much more. So this is how I felt after going through all of this, that I started the wrong way, and it was going to be out, but then I got the strike with AngularJS. You can check it out at github.com/mgonto/restangular. This is for the 1.x version of AngularJS. I will be releasing soon the Restangular-2.0 repository, which will be working with the next version of AngularJS. So thank you very much for listening, or at least pretending to. So I hope you really liked the presentation. And this was Models and REST APIs on AngularJS with Restangular. So if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask them. Oh, sorry, just one comment before. I will be talking in the NG Europe on October about Restangular 2.0. It's actually here in Paris. And if you want to buy a ticket for NG Europe, you can enter devox-2014 or enter to that URL if you want to take a picture, and you will get a 15% discount. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes?
How many features will you backport for Angular 1.x?
I'm sorry, I couldn't listen.
How many features will you backport for the 1.x?
Sorry.
You will be targeting Angular 2.0.
Yeah.
But we will most probably be staying with Angular 1.x for a few times. So how many features will you backport for the 1.x Angular version?
So what you're asking is how many features from Restangular 1.x will be in 2.0, right? That way around? How many features from 2.0 will be in 1.x? Okay. So what I will be doing is, at the beginning, as people won't be using Restangular 2.0 because people won't be using Angular 2.0, I will be porting actually most of the features. But once the AngularJS team will decide that they won't support Angular 1.x, that will be the same point that I will decide not to support it anymore. So I will just follow what the Angular team does, which I think should be the best, since if the Google team stops supporting Angular 1.x, I mean, most people will start switching. Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for listening.